morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Memory Safety and Exploit Management, Real-World Attacks and Defenses, sponsored by RunSafe Security and broadcast by Informa. I'm Michael Krieger with Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get going, let's just talk about why we're here. Memory safety vulnerabilities remain a major security risk for OT systems and embedded devices, with exploits like buffer overflows threatening reliability across industries. So today we're going to explore real-world memory safety weaknesses, analyzing CVEs, attack techniques, and their impact on the supply chains. We'll review global guidance from the NSA, CISA, and the EU, highlighting why rewriting software in memory-safe languages isn't always feasible. Instead, we'll showcase practical mitigation strategies, including real-time exploit detection and runtime protection to defend against both known and zero-day threats without modifying source code. But first, just a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, this webinar is designed to be interactive, and it certainly will be today. We have 3 polling questions, and I invite you to participate in those polls when they pop up. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will let you learn about today's speakers, download resources, share the webinar via social media, and participate in our Q&A that's going to take place at the end. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you can also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. And toward the end of our webinar, we'll ask you to provide feedback via the survey widget found at the bottom of your screen. Please take just a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback provides us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, just click on the help widget found at the bottom of your screen or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. And now on to the presentation, Memory Safety and Exploit Management, Real-World Attacks and Defenses. Discussing today's topic is Shane Fry, Chief Technology Officer for RunSafe Security, and Patrick Garity, Security Researcher with VulnCheck. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. And by the way, if you want to learn more about our speakers, you can find their bios in the speaker bio widget on your screen. Again, if you want to ask any questions, pop them into the Q&A. So I'm going to get started today with the polling question. And the poll is up here in front of us. It's, what is your organization's primary concern regarding memory safe vulnerabilities? Is it the impact on software supply chains, risk of real-world exploits, patching costs, or lack of defensive strategies? And while we wait for our attendees to complete the poll, let me ask you both a question. Can you explain what memory safety vulnerabilities are, and why are they particularly critical in embedded systems?
Yeah, that's a great opening question. So memory safety vulnerabilities, there's about 85, 86 common weakness enumerations, CWEs, that cover them in some shape, form, or fashion. And they're things like buffer overflows or heap use after freeze. And it's, they're a class of vulnerabilities that really are only present in compiled code. So you see them a lot in embedded devices, particularly in critical infrastructure and medical devices, and telecommunications and things like that. And they're really hard to find via static code scanning. And that's part of why they're, a major problem is, you can't just run a code scanner on it and expect to get 100% of your bugs taken out like you can with some other classes of vulnerabilities.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's take a look. See, we've had a number of our attendees have responded so far. Let's see what we're seeing. And number 1 is risk of real-world exploits. Any surprise there? No,
not really. As we look at embedded devices and critical infrastructure, real-world exploitation of those devices could be catastrophic. It could literally be a life-threatening event for individuals, for populations. So it certainly makes a lot of sense that that's a primary concern.
And with that, let's get on with the presentation. Gentlemen, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. So we already covered a little bit of this. What are the memory safety vulnerabilities? As I said, there's about 86 CWEs. The most common ones that you'll see are buffer overflows, heap use after freeze, heap-based buffer overflows, and out-of-bounds writes. You see a lot of CWE 787 in embedded systems, particularly, and about 70% of the vulnerabilities in compiled code are memory safety related. So you're not going to see SQL injection or cross-site scripting or things like that in the memory safety space. And you're less likely to see those in compiled code anyways, but about 70%, and that number can vary wildly depending on if you're, doing control systems versus, enterprise IT software that, compiled code. But about 70% for most embedded devices is about the average. We see sometimes upwards of 75%, depending on industry and company. So why should we care about these memory safety vulnerabilities though, right? Like there's a lot of security problems in the world to worry about, but 6 memory safety CVEs are on the list of the top 25 most dangerous software weaknesses of 2024. And so that's a list that MITRE puts out. And so that's, really talking to the potential gravity of these vulnerabilities being identified and exploited. So if you've got a memory safety vulnerability in your device, that can lead to arbitrary code execution, remote control of the device, denial of service, privilege escalation, as well as data exposure and theft. So a lot of potential impact to systems and software if these memory safety vulnerabilities are present in your device. And spoiler alert, these devices or these memory safety vulnerabilities are present in pretty much every piece of compiled code that exists there today. So Michael kind of keyed in on this earlier that we're going to talk a little bit about, how much attention this is getting globally. So our slides here kind of focus on NSA guidance and CISA. So in 2022, the National Security Agency came out and said, hey, this is a real problem. We need to fix it. And their guidance had really 2 pieces. You can either rewrite your code in a memory safe language, such as Rust or Golang, or you can deploy compiler hardening options and other runtime protections to provide those mitigations. And so that was really great guidance from the NSA, really kind of acknowledging the problem. And then if we look at CISA in the US with their secure by design best practices, they're advocating for people to put out memory safety roadmaps and build security into their software by design. And so that's been, a really big push for CISA for the last couple of years. And then not on the slides here, but equally important is the EU's Cyber Resiliency Act. So, that's looking a little bit broader and trying to bring in software bill of materials because one of the things that you have in compiled code is it's really hard to know all your software dependencies. But you could have a memory safety vulnerability come in from something in your supply chain, and that could be a problem for you. So we need to be able to look at the supply chain, and that's where the EU CRA has a really big emphasis on generating complete and accurate software bill of materials so you can understand the vulnerabilities that are present in software that is inside of your supply chain.
Hey, Shane, I have a question. In regards to some of the guidance, like how feasible is it actually for organizations to rewrite code to Go or Rust?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was going to talk about it later, but hey, let's chat about it now.
Oh, you are? Hey, we can talk about it later. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. The answer to that's really complex. So we undertook an effort last year to rewrite the portion of our code that runs on customer devices in Rust. And that took us about 6 months as a very small code base. And so, that worked, but it only works for the environments that support Rust. So we do a lot of embedded work. You can't run Rust in VxWorks 6.9. You can't run Rust in some of these other RTOSes and other embedded devices. And even in Linux, there's certain processors that Rust doesn't support, or they're lower on the guaranteed to work scale. So there's definitely some complications, even if you had the skill set and the people on staff, which, programmers are hard enough to find. Finding Rust programmers or Golang programmers that can do embedded development, they're even harder to find. That can be a challenge. And, we had a conversation or a webinar a couple of weeks ago with Schneider Electric, and they said they've got 500 million lines of source code. There's no way you could move that to any kind of memory safe language, this century. So, there's definitely value in doing new development in memory safe languages and kind of designing your systems, new devices and new software on newer devices and operating systems that support Rust. But there's a ton of stuff that's already out in the field today that needs protections, and so you can't just rewrite all your code and have that ready tomorrow or a week from now. That definitely takes time.
Thanks.
So, what are some examples of memory safety vulnerabilities? So the Morris worm from back in 1988 was really kind of the first major internet worm, and it caused widespread disruption and was kind of that first canary, if you will, that something's gone wrong in the software development world. Now we fast forward to more modern times. We have things like Heartbleed, which affected OpenSSL and a ton of infrastructure and devices on the internet. You have the Equifax breach in 2017 that was also memory safety vulnerabilities. The Saudi Aramco attacks in 2017, another big one that really hit critical infrastructure and disrupted systems in a major way. And then Urgent 11 back in 2019, there were 11 vulnerabilities and the majority of those were memory safety vulnerabilities that were found. And then we're seeing even today, and for the last couple of years, the various Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon campaigns are targeting those memory safety vulnerabilities as well.
And so let's move on to our next polling question. We'd like to hear from all of you in the audience, so please respond when you see it. What measures are currently in place in your organization to defend against memory-based attacks? Do you have real-time exploit detection and prevention tools? Do you do periodic code audits? Or is there minimal or nothing at all? And let me first of all also remind everyone you can send your questions in. I see some questions coming in. You can send them in at any time. We will get to them at the end of the event. And while we wait for the attendees to respond to the polling question, what are some of the big attacks that you're seeing today? What are the ones that are making headlines, or maybe the ones that we don't know about?
Yeah, I think the various nation state actors associated with Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, where nation states are targeting our critical infrastructure in the U.S. and in some cases they're getting caught, but that means there's probably a lot of cases where they're not getting caught or haven't been caught yet. And so, it's kind of an abstract thing for a lot of people to think about because it's not their laptop, their mobile device that's being exploited. But when you think about critical infrastructure, if clean water supply for New York City went down for a week, that's disastrous. If electricity is down for a week, that's disastrous. And so, there's a lot of these cyber attacks happening. And even, think about it in kind of different ecosystem entirely. You've got the Russia-Ukraine conflict where cyber attacks are being used to take out critical infrastructure as, to either disable Ukraine or Russia, or as, a preface for physical attacks in the space. So, the impacts can be very broad, and you're seeing this kind of all over the world.
Yeah, and let's take a look at the results of our poll. Well, it looks like about half of us are doing real-time exploit detection and prevention tools, but sadly, 40% say minimal or no proactive measures at all. Surprising there?
Yeah, I agree, Patrick.
Sorry, I'm like, what? No.
Yeah, that's a sad answer, but it's the truth, right? Even as we talk to cyber practitioners today, a lot of people are focused on the network. They're focused on the trust boundary between their devices and the outside world. Mm-hmm. And there's so much to do there. And really, when you look at what asset owners or software developers can do today, there's a lot less solutions for memory safety vulnerabilities than there are cloud security solutions. So it's not entirely surprising.
And so at this point, let's go and dive a little deeper into what we're seeing in terms of memory safety attacks and what industries are specifically being targeted.
Yeah, that sounds great. The other thing, I'll kind of highlight this as I go through. a lot of these devices are getting internet connected, whether they're supposed to be or not. And when we talk about critical infrastructure devices, like non-security companies are developing these devices a lot of times that end up being internet connected. So that has a pretty large contribution to risk for organizations too. So, I'm going to hop in a little bit, talk about like the trends as you had mentioned and impact. Obviously, we're seeing the number of known exploited vulnerabilities associated with memory safety grow. I think if you look at CISA the concentration is quite high as far as volume. And I think, that's one of the big things CISA is acknowledging is, hey, how can we defend or prevent memory safety vulnerabilities in general? VulnCheck, where I work, we maintain a larger KEV, known exploited vulnerabilities. You can generally see from a trend perspective, like the continued growth. This is also growing a similar trend with disclosure of vulnerabilities. And so there's more memory safety vulnerabilities continuing, and more of them are getting exploited that we know about, which poses a real risk to organizations. And then if we look at it from other perspectives, some of the challenges are some of the measures we're using for vulnerabilities, CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System being one of them. You get a combination of criticality of things that are critical, high, or medium. And this is just focusing on exploited vulnerabilities, right? So I think the aspect, certainly a very high importance, but not every one is necessarily identified from a vulnerability perspective as a high risk, yet threat actors are still targeting and taking advantage of them, which is a real risk to organizations. Now, if we dive in a little bit deeper in relation to known exploited vulnerabilities, what I like to do is look at, okay, what kind of product services are necessarily impacted. And so I focused on looking at the known exploited vulnerabilities over the past year, 2024, and categorizing them. And I think a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, hardware, embedded systems, network edge devices, like you can see software from every category being impacted by memory safety vulnerabilities, as well. But typically these are applications, embedded devices, and things that are being used for critical infrastructure across the board. So device management, hardware devices, ICS/OT devices, network edge devices. We hear stories, some of the big names all the time, of your Avanti, your Cisco, and we'll hop a little bit more into a vulnerability level on this. Your operating systems, your open source software. But really it's across the board, realizing that most applications and services were not developed until recently in memory safe languages. That's I think a key takeaway is really this can impact anything and everything to think about from a development perspective when you're building products, software, and services. Anything you want to add, Shane, before I hop into some more detail?
I think it's a fantastic view of the world because it covers everything from operating systems to open source to control systems to content management systems. There's a lot of problems across. This is not something that is unique to one industry or one vertical. And the number of times I talk to customers and they think that what they're doing is special or different, so they don't have this problem. This really kind of shows that everyone has this problem. Even the biggest in the world, right? The Googles, the Microsofts, that the Apples that spend probably more money than some companies have revenue on security teams. They still get it wrong. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, I think too, generally, I was talking to a friend this weekend who works at a medical device company, right? And they developed this device, and very quickly the product team wants to get it online so they get analytics and updates and all these other things. So, they didn't even think about memory safety or what code they were using or whether there was vulnerabilities, and immediately just want to connect the device to the internet. But yeah, generally speaking, I would say like a lot of internet connected things as well as user facing things, which typically users, of course, get targeted with malware and other tactics. So let's take a look at a few of the specific vulnerabilities we are going to hop in. So the first one, one other thing I did want to mention too on the industry side, sorry, before I go into specifics. Yeah, I mean, if you look at this list, there's manufacturing impacted, medical devices, embedded systems, critical infrastructure. I mean, across the board from an industry perspective, you're going to see these vulnerabilities everywhere, without a doubt. But particularly critical infrastructure, a lot of times, as I had mentioned, the companies that are developing these products are not security companies. So they tend to be more likely to have memory safety problems and issues. And then they end up getting internet connected, which is what I just mentioned a second ago. Avanti Connect Secure. So a few things, CVE 2025-0282. This is a vulnerability and the only vulnerability that we're talking about that is known to be exploited. Targeted by a threat actor, you put some information as far as the vulnerability itself. It actually impacts more than just Connect Secure, Policy Secure, you're on gateways, ETA gateways. So a lot of times organizations that are building multiple products with a similar software code base under the hood. And specifically, this is CWE 787, out of bounds right. It's known to be targeted by Hafnium from a threat actor perspective. And very quickly you can see a CVE is issued, like this coordinated disclosure at its best, right? Is the vendor identifies there's a vulnerability, there's exploitation, they disclose the vulnerability, they get it in a CVE, and then CISA adds it all on the same day, right? So very, very quick sense of urgency. I think currently it has around 8 exploits available. So like you can just go to GitHub or our exploit database, and there's public access to plenty of exploits for this. These are all internet connected devices as well, and likely used by just about everyone, different industries across the board. And specifically, I think in the Avanti advisory, stack-based overflow was mentioned. And what I want to emphasize here is remote code execution, enabling malware deployment on devices. Like this is a prime example of a memory safety vulnerability that's actively being targeted today.
Yeah, and you talked about it in kind of some of the earlier slides, Patrick, about not every company that's being targeted for memory safety vulnerabilities is a security company, but in this case, this is a VPN device, right? It's supposed to increase the security of your system, and so it's one of the very interesting philosophical questions that I think about often in the cybersecurity space is how impactful a security vulnerability in a security product can be, because most people think, oh, it's a security product, it's secure, and off they go. And you kind of let your guard down a little bit, but yet here we have a VPN device that is, remote code execution.
Yeah, I think the other thing with these devices is like it's really hard to get detection. Like it's just not built in to a lot of these embedded devices or edge devices. So the other two I have we have for examples, like they're not known exploited vulnerabilities. So we're transitioning. I don't want to mislead people here. But this is a Rockwell denial of service, and I'm spacing. I had the product somewhere. My apologies. The Power Monitor 1000 product, and I believe there's like several advisories on this one, so it's kind of interesting. You have NVD and a CWE of 94 issued by CISA. You have the vendor advisory with CWE 122, which is key-based buffer overflow. And then there's a CISA advisory as well. And CISA had, by the way, like there are CISA alerts. They have great ICS and OT advisories. But specifically, the things interesting to me too, like they emphasize possible remote code execution and then denial of service for this vulnerability as well.
Yeah.
Shane, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, as we were talking, leading into this, you found a really interesting thing, which is that this CWE 94 is what the original CVE was posted. But if you look at the advisory from Rockwell, they described it as CWE 122. And so, there's a lot of really interesting things as people get really narrowly focused on, I need to fix one CWE or one particular security problem, but there's a lot of subjectivity to which CWE gets picked, why, when. And so it's really easy to, kind of miss the mark of, there's a bigger picture, a bigger problem that needs to be solved. Even if CWE 94 is a reasonable CWE for this, because it is code injection through, a heap overflow, but could be a more correct answer, but there's no there could be wrong answers, I guess. But it's kind of interesting because you can narrowly focus a vulnerability management program on a certain set of CWEs and completely miss others that would definitely be impactful to devices or to your software.
Yep. Yeah, and the CWE is right. The description is wrong. code injection. Proper control is the right description for that specific CWE. So yeah, definitely CWE is complicated with all the roll-ups and different views of possible things people could pick. And then the last example we're going to hop into Siemens user management component. This impacts a bunch of different products like OpCenter, Synac, Somatic. And this was a CWE 122 heap-based buffer overflow. And I think everywhere I looked, like they all used the same CWE, which isn't always the case. And then sometimes there's multiple CWEs assigned with a vulnerability. But this has a critical CVSS score. Since there isn't exploitation evidence on the CVSS side, like that goes down to an 8.4, which is a medium. So a good example of some of the scoring and how things are scored can be impacted with Intel as well. And then, specifically unauthenticated remote attacker arbitrary code execution is what they specified in the vendor advisory for this vulnerability.
And with that, why don't we move on to our next polling question, where we want to know, would your organization benefit from tools that defend against vulnerabilities without changing the underlying code? I want to hear who says no to this one, I actually. While we wait for everyone to respond, let's take a question from one of our attendees. Mike asks, are you aware of any U.S. equivalent of the EU CRA?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Not directly. So there's some regulations. You see this in like the FDA for doing SBOM generation, delivery, and kind of vuln management along with that in order to get approval from the FDA for medical devices. But that's really it. From the regulation side, the DoD has some cybersecurity regulations as well. But broadly, no. And one of the things that's been really interesting as we talk to embedded device manufacturers is, there was a lot of interest in secure by design and how do we come up with a way that, we can get from where we are today to memory safe languages. But there was also a lot of pushback and there wasn't any regulatory teeth to it. And so we saw a shift in industry when the CRA became in law that, hey, now we have to actually do this. We can't just talk about it. We have to act. So we don't have anything in the U.S. right now. And I don't know if that'll change or not. But, it's certainly something that's moving from the CRA side, which, one of the really neat things about product companies shipping devices worldwide is the U.S. customers and U.S. software developers are building compliance with the CRA. So U.S. customers are going to get that benefit as well.
Okay, let's take a look at the results of our poll. Surprisingly, over a quarter of us say it's not a priority, but looks like most of us would benefit from this. And I know I would do anything I can to avoid rewriting code personally, but that's just me. I'm old. So let's move on to our next portion here. Let's talk about the fact that clearly memory safety is a widespread problem that can cause significant damage. So how would you recommend organizations begin to address these vulnerabilities in their software?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that can be done here. So, we talked about this a little bit already. You can rewrite your high-risk critical code in a memory-safe language. So, there's a lot of talk about rewriting everything, but really, there's probably identifiable bits and pieces of software or devices that are most often interacting with untrusted data. And so if you just rewrite those pieces in memory safe languages, that can get you good value while reducing your exposure to memory safety. And that's a path you see Google talk about, that they're working on with Android and Chrome and other, software that they develop, where they're slowly writing critical pieces in other memory safe languages. And that's having a notable impact on their memory safety vulnerabilities. So that's really great if you're operating in an environment where those memory safe languages can operate. But as we mentioned, there's a lot of environments where it's just not feasible today. But hopefully that changes. Definitely want to see these problems go away. The other thing you can do is you can follow Secure by Design best practices. So there's a lot of aspects of Secure by Design, like code scanning and secure software development life cycles, and software bill of materials can help you understand what you're shipping in your supply chain, if it's vulnerable, and doing patch management and things like that. Those can definitely help, right? Not everything in the world that's exploited is an unknown 0-day vulnerability. There's a lot of stuff that is antiquated on the internet that is still being exploited today, that might be new software just shipped with a bunch of old dependencies. So that's definitely something you can, if you keep up with patches and updating your dependencies, that can help too. And then obviously you can deploy runtime exploit prevention. That's one of the core capabilities of RunSafe, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But there's other solutions out there as well. But you don't have to just rewrite everything. And there's going to be solutions that fit inside your performance envelope to help get those exploits prevented without having to do brand new hardware and new complete re-architecting or rewriting of your software. Yeah, and Mike, I'm going to go ahead and talk to this since I see it in the Q&A. Salsa is another really good thing as well. Making sure that you're getting your software from a known good location, and you can kind of attest to the software and where it came from is definitely a great piece of advice as well. I only had so many places on the slide to put stuff, but that's a great thing that's happening. So what about runtime exploit prevention? So, a lot of times people are trying to bolt on security at the last minute. We understand it. We see that, every day with our customers. And so one of the things you've got to be able to do is get security in at, basically no performance overhead, because device manufacturers and software developers aren't just buying, top of the line hardware when they could go with something a lot cheaper. And so that's where RunSafe came out with our RunSafe Protect Source offering that does a load time function randomization. So if we look at the chart on the right in the middle, we've got three colored bars there. And the original world is kind of pre-2006. And today, with a lot of real-time operating systems, exploitation was really simple in those environments. You find a buffer overflow, you know exactly where your code is, you execute it. Those days were great. I miss those days from an exploit development side of things. And then in the mid-2000s, we get the introduction of address space layout randomization. That shifts your whole code around in memory. And that made exploitation harder. It makes it harder. But that was in 2006 that it was introduced. It's 2025. We still have memory safety vulnerabilities being exploited, so it's not a complete solution. And part of why that's the case is if an adversary is able to leak the address of one function in a program, they can build a completely robust and reliable exploit after that because they know where all your code is in memory. So what if we had a way to take that away, take the tools, the attackers that are targeting this memory safety vulnerability away from them, and can do it in a low overhead way? And that's where RunSafe Protect Source comes in. And every time the device boots or every time your process is launched, we reorder all the code around in memory, fix up all the addresses so we're not adding new code. There's nothing, introspecting your software. And then we hand back control to the original code that was running. And so we can be effectively 0% performance overhead. But then for an attacker's perspective, they're not able to see, they don't know where the code they want to execute is in memory, so they can't build those robust and reliable exploits. So that's something that can be deployed today in a lot of environments and get you the protection you need against these memory safety vulnerabilities. And, for a lot of our customers, they use this not to justify not patching, although we have some customers that are not patching because, as Patrick was talking about with your CVSS scoring, if you can say a vulnerability isn't reachable, it's not exploitable, then it's effectively a 0 CVSS score, or it's a lowered CVS score. So, we have customers that are doing that, and we've got customers that are using that as this mitigation technique as a way to delay getting patches out. So they don't have to be a firestorm at 2:00 in the morning on Christmas. They can get a patch out next week or the week after.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Let's talk about basically what we talked about today. That number one, this is a persistent problem. It's not going away, and it can pose significant risk. Memory safety threats are growing and are widespread across industries, and by applying secure by design best practices and deploying runtime protections, you can mitigate some of these vulnerabilities for more secure software and resilience against cyber risk. And one of the best ways to do that is, give this RunSafe Security platform a try. You can request a risk reduction analysis just by scanning that QR code in there. Better safe than sorry is what I always say. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for your presentation. Before we get to our Q&A, let me direct everyone's attention to the webinar survey. If you have closed the box, you can just click on the icon to reopen it. And we really appreciate you completing the survey. It just helps us make these events better for you and going forward. So let's get going. Let me bring up the Q&A and see what questions we have come in. First of all, we have a question from Mike C., who wants to know, how does your product compare to MorphoSec?
Yeah, so MorphoSec's doing a lot of really interesting things. I think in their current world today, they're moving a little bit more towards kind of the anti-ransomware, market space, which is not where, RunSafe is targeting. We're trying to prevent adversaries from getting on the device before they can do any of their exploitation. But the other kind of big difference from our perspective is we're really focused in the Linux and kind of embedded device space. MorphoSec is doing a lot of their work primarily in the Windows space, as far as I understand. I'm not a MorphoSec employee, so there's kind of limited availability there. But there's a lot of solutions, right? I mean, you think about other moving target defense or kind of binary-based solutions that try to bolt security in. Some of them can be higher performance overhead. We're effectively 0% performance overhead, with the exception of like processor cache hits and misses. And then there's other, we integrate in at build time. So, we work with developers as they're building their software, and that allows our customers to have confidence that the software that they're shipping is going to work with our protections, because we're not having to guess at, disassembly and injecting our code properly. We can just do everything we need to at source time.
Great. Here's a question from, did you have something you wanted to add to that? I'm sorry. Okay. Here's a question from Charles, who wants to know what techniques are available to balance the trade-off between memory safety and system resource limitations.
Yeah. So, that's very closely related to the last question almost. A lot of folks can't afford to just add new hardware. So, you can look at, some compiler options. You can look at moving to Java or some other, language like Python, but then you're going to get memory safety at the cost of performance, or disk space, or things like that. And so that's where, we really think we've hit the sweet spot of giving you enough security without slowing down your devices. So it's meaningful security, but you don't have to have a lot of extra resources available. And our first commercial customer actually is running software on a ARM processor, single core, slower than an original Raspberry Pi from 10, 15 years ago. And we're able to work in that environment all the way up to full server racks. But we work in really resource constrained environments very well.
Okay, thanks for that. Keep the questions coming. This one from Lloyd, who asks, how do I decide what systems to focus on first to achieve memory safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I talked about earlier, there's a lot of security that you can do. So how do you prioritize? And I think there's a couple things to think about. The first thing is you can do a risk reduction analysis. You can look at, what's your threat to unknown vulnerabilities, what's your threat to known vulnerabilities in your supply chain, and find, the highest risk areas and go, build solutions there. The other thing you can do, or you can do both, is you can look at, what software, what pieces of your device are most externally facing. That's where you're going to have, for the most part, your biggest attack surface, outside of maybe physical attacks of someone physically messing with your device. And so you can look at those pieces of software and what their dependencies are, and kind of try and harden those external facing pieces first.
Yeah, I think one more to add. You kind of mentioned external or internet facing. I always tell people not to forget things that are user facing, because
yes,
users tend to click on links and do other bad stuff. Not trying to shame the user, but it would be so
easy. It would be so easy to do all this development if there are no users involved. So finally, let's get to a question from Diane, who says, do you see large organizations working on memory safety, and how much resources will it take to achieve?
Yeah, there definitely is, right? Google and Microsoft and Apple are expending probably hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know. It's in the millions of dollars for sure. Hiring security practitioners that understand this space to try and solve it. As we talk to, some of the big banks and some of the big social media platforms, they're doing a lot of their own custom builds of software to try and, eliminate the security risk. And so, there's a lot of effort being put behind it, and a lot of the big device manufacturers are investing in this as well. Nobody wants to be the reason why a customer was exploited, or devices were, systems were taken down, or data was breached. And so there's definitely an emphasis on this across organizations large and small.
And just a comment from a couple of comments that have come in from Mike Lee. He says, to add to all this, unfortunately, not all tools aim to help developers in their work, like Sync, support Rust and other memory safe languages.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're currently undergoing an ISO 27001 audit, and one of the things in order to be compliant with that standard is you got to do code scanning, and you have a language like Rust, and there's just not a lot of good solutions for that out there. So that's a problem, but Rust does give you a lot of great benefits at compile time for doing a lot of those checks for you. So that's a trade-off there for sure.
And here's a multi-part question from Mike C., who wants to know, how does your product work? Does it work by manipulating program execution in memory? And if so, do certain products not work with your product?
Yeah, great question. So we end up being in the compilation process. And then at runtime, we become the entry point of your program, of your software that's running. And then what we do is we reorder all the code, fix up all the assembly instructions, all the pointers that say where code is, where data is, all the things. And then we hand off back to the main program. So we haven't really run into anything that's not compatible. We've got some customers that have code that was written in the 80s that we're protecting today in 2025. And so we work with, kind of all kinds of build systems, all kinds of software. I'm sure we're eventually going to find a customer that's running an FPGA with a processor, and they're doing in-memory hashing of, some region of memory, that we'll have to figure out an integration there. But Really, there's no product or software that won't work. We do have some limitations as far as what processes we support today, but we can expand that. So we've got a lot of flexibility to support all kinds of software.
Any final comments before we wrap, gentlemen?
I think we've covered a lot. I don't know what more to say. Great questions.
I'll say thank you. I want to say thank you to Shane Fry and Patrick Garity. Dark Reading appreciate your time and your expertise on today's topic. And thanks to our sponsor, RunSafe Security, as well as to everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation in the Q&A and in the polling questions. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been able to join us live today. And finally, this webinar is copyright 2025 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and RunSafe Security, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and opinions. On behalf of our guests from RunSafe Security, I'm Michael Krieger. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.